"You might want to tell your officers to slow down," I said, watching the first patrol cruiser roll to a stop in front of me. "Because this is going to be very embarrassing for somebody." The smell of fresh asphalt still lingered in the summer air as the moving truck idled behind me, its diesel engine humming with that steady rhythm only long-haul drivers seem able to ignore. I tightened my grip on a worn leather briefcase, while the morning sun reflected off rows of perfectly identical mailboxes lining the entrance to Ashcroft Ridge. Every lawn looked like it had been measured with a ruler. Every flower bed looked professionally staged. Every house wore the same expensive shade of beige. It was the kind of neighborhood where appearances mattered more than common sense. I had barely stepped out of my pickup before a white luxury SUV rolled across the street and stopped sideways in front of my driveway. The driver's door opened with theatrical confidence. Out stepped Margaret Holloway, president of the Homeowners Association, dressed like she had somewhere far more important to be. Her smile never reached her eyes. "You can't move in until the HOA approves your paperwork," she announced loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear. I looked at the stack of sealed moving boxes sitting in the truck, then back at her. "I'm not in your HOA," I answered calmly. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before she laughed. Not because it was funny, but because she believed she had already won. "Everyone on this street belongs to this HOA," she replied. "Either you comply or you leave." I shrugged, locked my truck, and reached for another box. "I'm staying." Her expression hardened. She pulled out her phone without another word. I heard only a few pieces of the conversation. Trespassing, refusing compliance, suspicious individual, possible disturbance. By the time she hung up, several front doors had quietly opened. Curtains shifted. Garage doors paused halfway. The entire neighborhood seemed to enjoy live entertainment before lunch. Less than 10 minutes later, flashing blue lights reflected across polished windows as two patrol cars turned onto the street. One officer stepped out with the relaxed posture of someone expecting a routine neighborhood disagreement. Another stayed near the cruiser, scanning the scene without saying much. Margaret crossed her arms, satisfied, already acting like the verdict had been delivered. "That's him," she declared, pointing directly at me. "He admitted he isn't part of our HOA and refuses to leave private property." The officer looked at me. "Sir, mind telling me what's going on today?" I smiled politely. "Absolutely. I just bought this property, and I'm moving in." Margaret interrupted before I finished my sentence. "He's lying." Her confidence was almost impressive. The previous owner would never have sold to someone who ignores community rules. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I set the box down carefully, brushed the dust from my hands, and glanced toward the leather briefcase resting on the passenger seat of my truck. Inside was a thick blue envelope that had been signed exactly 72 hours earlier. I hadn't opened it since leaving the attorney's office because I already knew what it contained. The neighbors watched as if waiting for a shouting match. They were expecting drama. They were expecting anger. What they were about to witness was paperwork. And none of them, not Margaret, not the officers, not the curious faces peeking through expensive front windows, had any idea that the same signature, transferring ownership of my new home, had quietly made me the legal landlord of the commercial office where their fearless HOA president had been running her real estate business for the past 6 years. Most people assumed I had made my money flipping houses because that was the easiest story to believe. The truth smelled less like fresh paint and more like old paper, courthouse archives, and coffee that had been sitting on a conference table for hours. I had spent the last 12 years buying properties that everyone else ignored. Half-abandoned shopping centers, aging office buildings, small apartment complexes with complicated ownership records, places that looked ordinary until you followed the paperwork all the way back to the beginning. My father used to tell me that real estate was never about buildings, it was about signatures. Buildings cracked, roofs leaked, markets changed, contracts survived. That lesson stayed with me long after he passed away, and every deal I made afterward started with one simple question. Who actually owns the rights that everyone else takes for granted? That habit had saved me more than once. 3 weeks before moving into Ashcroft Ridge, my attorney called while I was inspecting an old warehouse outside Fort Worth. The air inside smelled like dust, machine oil, and forgotten history. He sounded unusually excited. A regional investment group wanted to sell an entire commercial strip before the end of the quarter. They wanted one buyer, one closing, and no delays. At first glance, it looked like a collection of ordinary storefronts: a dentist, a coffee shop, a small insurance office, a real estate agency. Nothing remarkable. Then I noticed something interesting. Nearly every business in the center had long-term lease agreements that had never been renegotiated after the previous owner retired. Stable tenants, reliable income, clean maintenance records. Exactly the kind of quiet investment that rarely reached the public market. We closed the transaction in less than 48 hours. The final meeting lasted barely 30 minutes. A few signatures, a handshake, a blue envelope containing every recorded document. My attorney smiled as he slid it across the polished oak table. I placed it inside my leather briefcase without much celebration. I had another inspection scheduled that afternoon, and life moved on. I never bothered researching the individual tenants because I was planning to review every lease after settling into my new house. Looking back, that decision probably made the surprise even better. As for Ashcroft Ridge, I had chosen the neighborhood for one simple reason. It sat close enough to downtown for work, but far enough away to enjoy quiet evenings on the back porch. I liked neighborhoods where people waved instead of rushing past each other. I liked walking after dinner while sprinklers clicked across freshly cut lawns. I believed communities worked best when neighbors respected each other's space instead of trying to control it. Apparently, not everyone shared that philosophy. During the week before closing on the house, my realtor casually mentioned that the Homeowners Association president liked to stay involved with every new arrival. She laughed while saying it, almost as if it were a harmless personality trait. I smiled politely and changed the subject. I had dealt with difficult personalities before. They usually disappeared the moment contracts entered the conversation. Standing there with 2 police officers watching me and half the neighborhood pretending not to stare, I realized this situation was different. Margaret Holloway was not protecting a neighborhood. She genuinely believed she owned the authority to decide who belonged there. The strange part was that I still did not recognize her face. But inside the unopened blue envelope resting quietly inside my briefcase, her business address appeared on one of the lease agreements that I had legally purchased only 3 days earlier. Officer Daniel Harper accepted my driver's license with the calm expression of someone who had handled 100 neighborhood disputes before breakfast. He glanced at the address, compared it with the paperwork in his hand, then looked back at me. "So you purchased the property this week?" he asked. "That is correct," I replied. Before I could say another word, Margaret stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed volume counted as evidence. "He is refusing to acknowledge the association," she insisted. "Everyone here signs the community agreement before moving in." I noticed Officer Harper never interrupted either of us. He simply listened while the faint hiss of lawn sprinklers drifted across the street, and the smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the warm scent of mulch baking under the Texas sun. His younger partner quietly wrote notes without reacting. Margaret interpreted their silence as agreement. "This neighborhood has standards," she continued. "If people can simply ignore the rules, property values collapse." She spoke with polished confidence, like someone who had delivered the same speech dozens of times. The neighbors nodded along. Some folded their arms. Others whispered from shaded driveways, watching every second, as though the entire street had become an outdoor courtroom. What struck me was not her attitude toward me, it was the way everyone else automatically accepted it. They had become accustomed to asking permission before making ordinary decisions. One elderly man walked outside, noticed Margaret speaking with the officers, and quietly turned around without checking his own mailbox. A young couple unloading groceries paused until she finished talking, before carrying bags into their garage. Nobody questioned why. They simply adapted to her presence. My realtor had mentioned she liked being involved. That description now seemed almost humorous. Margaret did not merely involve herself. She occupied every conversation until everyone else forgot they had a choice. Officer Harper finally asked, "Sir, did anyone prevent you from accessing your property before today?" I nodded toward the moving truck. "Only the vehicle parked across my driveway," Margaret answered before I could continue. "That was necessary until we verified his status." The officer slowly looked toward the white sport utility vehicle blocking my entrance. "Ma'am, is that your vehicle?" "Of course," she answered proudly. "I was protecting the neighborhood." Harper thanked her politely and wrote something in his notebook. I noticed the first hint of uncertainty cross her face. She expected immediate validation, not questions. She quickly changed directions. You should also know, he refused to complete our approval forms. That much was true. The forms had been waiting in my mailbox when I arrived that morning. I had not even opened the envelope, because ownership records always came before neighborhood paperwork. Margaret assumed my silence meant ignorance. In reality, I had simply developed the habit of reading documents in the correct order. First the deed, then the survey, then the title policy. Everything else could wait. My leather briefcase remained exactly where I had left it inside the truck, untouched beneath the blue envelope containing documents that neither the officers nor the neighbors knew existed. Margaret kept speaking, listing architectural rules, landscaping requirements, parking restrictions, and approval procedures with remarkable precision. She knew every section by memory. She also believed those rules gave her complete control over every person standing on the street. Watching her build that argument piece by piece, I realized she was doing something far more valuable than accusing me. She was carefully establishing exactly how much authority she believed she possessed. Sometimes the strongest evidence does not come from paperwork. Sometimes it comes from listening while someone confidently explains why they think the law is already on their side. Officer Harper closed his notebook for a moment and looked toward the moving truck parked at the curb. The driver leaned against the cab with the quiet patience of someone who had seen enough delayed closings and neighborhood disagreements to know better than to get involved. The steady rumble of the diesel engine blended with birds singing somewhere beyond the rows of maple trees. It should have been the peaceful first morning in my new home. Instead, every passing minute seemed to encourage Margaret to push a little farther. Since he refuses to cooperate, she announced, I will also need the moving company to stop unloading until the board reviews this situation. The driver raised an eyebrow but wisely waited for the officers before moving another box. Margaret interpreted his hesitation as another victory. She walked toward my driveway and pointed at the stack of sealed cartons inside the truck. None of those items should enter the property until we finish our inspection. I looked at her for a second, then back at the officers. Is there a law requiring my furniture to ask permission before entering my own house? Officer Harper almost smiled, before returning to his professional expression. No, sir. Margaret immediately stepped in again. Not state law. Community policy. She spoke those two words with remarkable confidence, as though community policy somehow carried the same weight as property law. The neighbors continued gathering along the sidewalks. A man walking his golden retriever stopped completely. A teenager pretending to wash his father's pickup never took his eyes off the conversation. Even the landscaping crew working across the street slowed their equipment as if they did not want to miss the outcome. Margaret thrived on an audience. The larger the crowd became, the more certain she sounded. She reached into a leather folder and removed several printed forms with color tabs marking different sections. These are the architectural compliance documents, parking regulations, visitor restrictions, exterior modification standards, and new resident acknowledgement forms, she explained, while extending the stack toward me. Sign them today and we can avoid unnecessary problems. I accepted the papers without reading them. The fresh ink carried that unmistakable smell of recently printed office documents. I flipped through the pages slowly before placing them neatly on top of a moving box. I appreciate the effort, I said calmly. I prefer reviewing legal documents after I finish reading the ones that actually transferred ownership. That answer clearly frustrated her, because it denied the confrontation she seemed to expect. She wanted an argument. She wanted raised voices. Instead, she received patience. Officer Harper watched the exchange carefully. Sir, have you threatened anyone today? He asked. No. Have you refused lawful instructions from law enforcement? No. He nodded once and turned toward Margaret. Ma'am, at this point I have not observed any criminal activity. The words landed with surprising weight. Several neighbors quietly exchanged glances. Margaret responded almost immediately. Then at least document his refusal to comply with the association. Harper wrote another short note without commenting. I recognized the difference immediately. He was documenting what had happened, not validating her conclusions. That distinction mattered more than she realized. Every statement she volunteered became part of an official record she believed would strengthen her position. I knew something she did not. Records have a habit of surviving long after emotions disappear. And somewhere inside my truck, beneath the blue envelope that had remained unopened since closing day, rested another collection of records that would soon redefine every assumption she had made since stepping in front of my driveway that morning. I had learned years ago that silence unsettled controlling people far more than arguments ever could. Every time I chose not to interrupt Margaret, she filled the empty space herself. Every new sentence gave Officer Harper another detail to remember. Every assumption became another piece of the timeline. The warm breeze carried the faint scent of fresh pine mulch across the sidewalks, while the moving truck continued idling behind me, patiently waiting for permission that, legally speaking, it had never needed. I walked to the passenger side of my pickup, opened the door, and picked up the leather briefcase without saying a word. Several neighbors leaned forward ever so slightly, expecting me to pull out some dramatic legal document or begin an angry speech. Instead, I simply placed the briefcase on the tailgate and closed the latch again. The blue envelope remained inside. It was not time yet. Timing mattered almost as much as the documents themselves. Margaret noticed the briefcase immediately. "If those are legal papers for the association, you can hand them to me," she said with complete confidence. "I review everything before new residents receive approval." I smiled politely. "These are not for the association." She frowned, clearly irritated that I had answered without giving her anything useful. "Then there is no reason to keep delaying this." She looked toward the moving crew. "You may unload after he completes our paperwork." The foreman finally spoke for the first time all morning. "Ma'am, our customer hired us to move furniture, not negotiate contracts." His calm voice carried across the street, followed by another brief silence. Officer Harper nodded toward the crew. "They can continue their work." Margaret's expression tightened for only a moment before she recovered. "Fine," she replied. "Then I will begin documenting every violation from the first day." She opened another folder and started writing. The sound of her pen scratching across paper was strangely louder than the truck engine. She noted the time, the position of the trailer, the landscaping, even the temporary placement of a cardboard box near the walkway. She documented everything with remarkable dedication. Watching her work reminded me of something my father once told me while reviewing closing documents late one evening. He had looked over the top of his reading glasses and said, "People who love paperwork usually assume everyone else is afraid of it." I was never afraid of paperwork. I respected it. There was a difference. Contracts did not care who sounded important in a neighborhood meeting. Recorded deeds did not change because someone spoke confidently. Lease agreements certainly did not rewrite themselves to match someone's opinion. Across the street, a woman quietly asked another neighbor whether this kind of confrontation happened often. The answer came in a whisper I was apparently not meant to hear. "Only when Margaret thinks someone needs to learn the rules." That sentence stayed with me, not because it offended me, but because it explained everything. This was no longer about landscaping standards or association policies. It had become a routine performance that everyone expected, and very few questioned. Margaret believed she was teaching me my place. In reality, she was giving me something much more valuable than an argument. She was creating a clear public record of exactly how she exercised authority before anyone knew the complete legal relationship that already existed between us. And with every passing minute, the unopened blue envelope resting quietly inside my briefcase became less like a surprise and more like the final page of a story that only one person on the entire street had already finished reading. Officer Harper returned my driver's license and folded his notebook closed for the second time that morning. The tension on the street had changed. It no longer felt like a confrontation waiting to explode. It felt like everyone was waiting for a question nobody had thought to ask yet. The moving crew quietly resumed unloading furniture, the dull thump of cardboard boxes, and the squeak of hand trucks echoing across the driveways. Margaret watched every trip from the truck to the front door as though each box represented another personal defeat. She stepped directly into my path once more. "This is not over," she said. "The board meets every Thursday evening. We can issue violations, fines, and legal notices if necessary." I adjusted the strap on my briefcase and answered as calmly as I had all morning. "I am sure your board follows every document very carefully." She smiled again, believing she had regained control. "We certainly do." Those 4 words settled into my mind like another signed affidavit. My attorney had always reminded me that people reveal the most when they think they are winning. Officer Harper cleared his throat. "Sir, unless there is something else you need from us, it appears you are free to continue moving into your residence." "Thank you, officer," I replied. He nodded politely before turning toward Margaret. Ma'am, if additional civil matters arise, they should be handled through the proper legal channels. She accepted the answer without looking satisfied. The patrol cars remained parked at the curb while the officers finished their reports, and the neighbors slowly drifted back toward their homes, although not one of them completely stopped watching. Curiosity is remarkably persistent in quiet neighborhoods. I finally reached for the leather latches on my briefcase. They clicked open with a crisp metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Inside rested the thick blue envelope exactly where I had left it after closing. The edges were still perfectly sharp. I carefully removed it and placed it on the tailgate of my truck. Margaret glanced at it only briefly before dismissing it with a confident wave of her hand. If that is another title document, it does not change our community requirements. You are correct, I answered. It changes something entirely different. I opened the envelope and removed several neatly organized folders. The first contained my recorded deed for the house. The second contained title insurance. The third contained closing statements for the commercial property purchase that had been completed 72 hours earlier. I slowly turned to the page listing every tenant included in the acquisition. I had still not studied every name myself until that very moment. My finger moved down the printed list one line at a time. Coffee shop, dental office, insurance agency. Then I stopped. HOA Premier Realty, Suite 204, 5-year commercial lease. I looked from the page to the sign on Margaret's white sport utility vehicle. The same company logo appeared across the driver's door in polished navy lettering. The same business name was embroidered above the pocket of her jacket. For the first time that morning, I saw uncertainty replace certainty in her expression. She noticed exactly where my eyes had settled. Without raising my voice or taking a single step toward her, I quietly compared the lease agreement in my hand with the logo on her vehicle one more time. Then I looked back at her and asked the simplest question I had spoken all day. Margaret, your real estate office is still located in Suite 204 at Brookstone Commons, is it not? The entire street seemed to forget how to breathe. Margaret stared at the page in my hand, then at the logo on her vehicle, then back at the page again. It was a tiny movement, barely noticeable, but it was the first genuine crack in the confidence she had carried all morning. Why are you asking about my office? She replied, trying to sound casual. I slid the lease agreement out of the folder and held it where both officers could see the heading without taking a single step closer. The paper still carried that crisp texture of a freshly recorded closing package. Because I purchased Brookstone Commons 3 days ago, I answered. Every active commercial lease transferred with the property. Officer Harper glanced at the document, then at Margaret. His expression remained professional, but his eyes lingered on the property address for an extra second. Margaret laughed, although it sounded noticeably different from before. That has nothing to do with this neighborhood. No, I agreed. It has nothing to do with this neighborhood. It has everything to do with our legal relationship. The breeze flipped one corner of the lease, exposing the signature page underneath. I placed my finger beside the ownership transfer and calmly continued. According to the county recording office, I became the owner of the building on Monday morning. Your brokerage occupies Suite 204 under a 5-year commercial lease, signed with the previous owner. As of Monday, that lease became my responsibility. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. Even the landscaping crew across the street had stopped working again. Margaret folded her arms, searching for another angle. If that is true, it still does not give you authority over this association. You are absolutely right, I replied. I have never claimed authority over the association. That answer caught her completely off balance. She had prepared herself to defend the homeowners association. She had not prepared for someone who had no interest in taking it over. I simply find it interesting, I continued, that the person who reminded me all morning about respecting contracts also happens to lease office space under one. Officer Harper looked between us before asking a simple question. Ma'am, is that your business listed on the document? Margaret hesitated for the first time since arriving. Yes, she admitted quietly. Harper nodded once. Then it appears this portion of the discussion concerns a private commercial matter, not a criminal complaint. He made one final note in his notebook before slipping the pen into his pocket. Around us, the neighbors began whispering again, but the tone had changed completely. Earlier they had expected to watch a newcomer learn the neighborhood rules. Now they were watching the person who enforced those rules realize she had unknowingly spent the entire morning confronting the owner of the building where she unlocked her office every weekday. I carefully returned the lease agreement to its folder and closed the blue envelope without adding another word. There was no reason to celebrate. There was no reason to embarrass her further. Contracts did not need dramatic speeches. They only needed to exist. As Margaret stood there, trying to reorganize everything she thought she understood, I realized the real surprise was not that I owned the commercial property. The real surprise was that I had not mentioned it until she had finished explaining, in front of witnesses and responding officers alike, exactly how seriously she believed every signed agreement should be respected. Officer Harper thanked both of us for our cooperation, gave a brief nod, and returned to his patrol car. Within another minute, the flashing lights disappeared around the corner, leaving only the distant sound of traffic and the soft clicking of sprinklers, starting another watering cycle across the neighborhood. One by one, the neighbors drifted back toward their homes, although more than a few glanced over their shoulders before disappearing behind front doors. The show they had expected had ended very differently than anyone imagined. Margaret remained standing beside her sport utility vehicle, unusually quiet. For the first time all morning, she seemed less interested in telling everyone what the rules were and more interested in reviewing them herself. I returned the folders to the blue envelope, placed everything neatly inside the leather briefcase, and continued directing the movers. The smell of cardboard, fresh lumber, and furniture polish slowly replaced the tension that had filled the air only minutes earlier. By early afternoon, most of the boxes were stacked inside the house. The moving truck pulled away, leaving the neighborhood almost perfectly silent again. 3 days later, I visited Brookstone Commons for the first time as its owner. Morning sunlight reflected across the storefront windows, while the familiar aroma of roasted coffee drifted from the cafe near the entrance. Contractors were repainting several parking lines, and a maintenance technician greeted me with a friendly wave before handing over the weekly inspection report. Everything looked exactly as it had during closing. Quiet, well-maintained, predictable. That was exactly how I liked commercial property. My property manager, Linda Foster, met me outside with a folder containing tenant files scheduled for routine review. Nothing urgent, she said, just standard lease confirmations, insurance certificates, and annual maintenance updates. I nodded. Business as usual. We began visiting each office one at a time, introducing ourselves as the new ownership team. The dentist welcomed us with a handshake. The insurance agency had already emailed updated contact information. The coffee shop owner asked whether the landscaping schedule would remain the same. Every conversation lasted only a few minutes, because that is how professional business relationships are supposed to work. Eventually, we reached Suite 204, Holloway Premier Realty. The polished glass door reflected the afternoon sun almost perfectly. Margaret looked up from her desk as we entered. For just a second, surprise crossed her face again, before she stood and offered a careful smile. It was noticeably different from the one she had worn outside my house. There was no audience here, no homeowners, no patrol cars, only business records, lease files, and 2 adults discussing a commercial agreement. Linda introduced me as the new property owner and placed a neatly organized information packet on the conference table. It contained updated payment instructions, emergency maintenance contacts, insurance verification reminders, and a schedule for routine exterior improvements already planned before the purchase. Nothing unusual, nothing punitive, exactly the same packet every tenant received. Margaret slowly opened the folder and reviewed each page. Finally, she looked up and said, "So the lease continues under the same terms." I smiled politely. Every signed agreement remains exactly as written, unless both parties decide otherwise. She quietly nodded, perhaps remembering her own words from only a few days earlier about respecting contracts. We shook hands, exchanged professional courtesies, and concluded the meeting in less than 15 minutes. As I walked back across the parking lot, I realized the greatest advantage paperwork ever gives you is not the power to punish someone. It gives you the freedom to remain completely professional, while the documents quietly speak for themselves. The seasons changed quietly after that, just as they always do in neighborhoods where people eventually return to ordinary routines. Autumn leaves collected along the curbs. Porch lights came on a little earlier every evening. The sound of lawnmowers gave way to the softer hum of leaf blowers, and Ashcroft Ridge slowly settled back into the peaceful place I thought I had purchased from the beginning. The difference was not the neighborhood itself. The difference was the atmosphere. People waved more often. Conversations became easier. Neighbors who had watched our first morning from behind half-opened garage doors now stopped to introduce themselves while walking their dogs or collecting the mail. One retired couple even brought over homemade cookies during my second month in the house, laughing about how everyone had assumed I would be another family that quickly moved away after dealing with unnecessary conflict. I simply smiled and thanked them. There was no reason to revisit that morning, because everyone already remembered it. Word travels surprisingly fast when a story begins with police cruisers and ends with recorded property documents. At Brookstone Commons, business continued exactly as it should. Rent arrived on schedule. Maintenance requests were handled promptly. Parking lots stayed clean. Every tenant received the same level of professionalism, regardless of who they were. Margaret's office remained open. Her clients continued coming and going, and every interaction we had afterward stayed courteous and businesslike. We never discussed that first morning again, because there was nothing left to argue about. The contracts already said everything that needed to be said. Several weeks later, while reviewing quarterly maintenance reports with Linda, I found myself holding the same blue envelope that had rested inside my briefcase throughout that entire encounter. The edges were no longer perfectly sharp. The folder had been opened dozens of times by then. Yet every signature inside remained exactly the same. I thought back to my father sitting across a worn kitchen table years earlier, with stacks of closing documents spread between cups of cold coffee. He had smiled without looking up from the paperwork and said, "Respect every contract, especially the ones that protect people you disagree with. That is how trust survives." I understood those words much better now than I had back then. It would have been easy to use my position to create unnecessary problems. It would have been easy to answer pride with pride. Instead, I chose the only approach that ever made long-term business sense. Fairness is remarkably predictable. When everyone receives the same treatment under the same agreement, conflict usually fades on its own. Looking back, I realized the most important moment had not been opening the blue envelope. It had happened much earlier when I decided to stay calm, while everyone expected me to argue. Silence gave the facts room to breathe. Patience gave the documents time to matter. By the end of that first day, the moving truck was gone. The police had finished their reports, and my furniture finally sat where it belonged, inside my new home. The leather briefcase rested on a shelf in my office, the blue envelope tucked safely inside, for whatever future transaction life might bring. Every object from that morning had found its proper place. So had every person. Ownership was never about speaking the loudest, winning the biggest argument, or proving someone wrong in front of a crowd. Ownership was accepting responsibility after the crowd went home. The strongest authority I have ever carried did not come from a raised voice, a title, or even a deed. It came from honoring the signatures I asked others to honor as well. In the end, the neighborhood did not remember who called the police first. They remembered who stayed calm, respected the law, and let the paperwork tell the story. Justice is never the loudest voice on the street. It is simply the one that remains standing after every page has been read.